Bonita Meyersfeld. She's from the Centre for Applied Legal Studies, and of course they are representing the South African Human Rights Commission, and also the SABC reporter who is covering this story, Nozin Tombamia. Good to have you. Welcome to Morning Live. Thank you both of you for taking the time out. Tommy, you were there. What was it like yesterday? What was the feeling amongst the protesters?
Amongst the protesters, specifically the miners, there was a lot of determination. There was a lot of anger towards government for what they perceived as a lack of interest in their plight. They seemed extremely determined to get their voices heard and to engender change in terms of getting government to pay for their lawyers' legal fees. So it was quite an electric atmosphere at the Union buildings yesterday. The march from Centurion Stadium all the way through Pretoria CBD up until the Union buildings, it was quite electric, and you found that the numbers grew and grew with citizens joining in the protest and or marching with the protesters and specifically the marchers to get to the Union buildings. But there's definitely a lot of anger around the whole issue of lack of funding, state funding, and the miners are determined to get some sort of funding. For them, it's not about getting funding from different people. It's about the morality of it. It's about getting government to be fair to all the parties that are in the Farlam Commission or that are participating in the Farlam Commission.
Well, Bonita, I mean, wouldn't this be a basic human right to afford the people with either legal representation or the funding to get justice?
I think Ntombi hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the morality, and I think there's a moral question and then there's a legal question. So ideally the two should be the same question, but they aren't always. Currently the legal requirement is not that the state provides funding in all legal or even quasi-legal circumstances. So the requirement in the Constitution is that the state must provide legal representation if you are subject to criminal proceedings, in which case there's that power inequality, or if indeed you are a child and therefore dependent on the state for your representation. Otherwise, there's no legal obligation to ensure that a person who is participating in some type of judicial process has legal representation.
Yeah, in such a sensitive case like this, you know, one would think that there would be room to maneuver.
Well, that brings in the moral, if you like, strategic question. And if one considers why there's a commission of inquiry as opposed to a court process. You have a commission of inquiry because it's not quite a court. And that means it's supposed to have a slightly more human element. It's supposed to engage all the parties in a manner that is less legalistic. And of course, South Africa is the champion of that with our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We got it right. And I regret that as far as the Marikana Commission of Inquiry is concerned, that aspect of it, the human aspect of it, the importance of hearing the voices has not been struck.
Yeah.
With the result that I can imagine the deep anger and resentment at a response from government that says, we're going to set up a commission of inquiry, but we're not actually going to pay for your legal representation.
Yeah. Let's talk about the political parties that were present yesterday, because that was quite something to actually see a lot of different parties standing together. You know, I've just been having a look at some of the visuals, and from what I saw Julius Malema there. I saw representatives from the DA. Who else was being represented there from political parties?
It was quite a number of different opposition parties. You had the UDM, Bantu Holomisa was there from the UDM.
Okay.
You had Musiwa Lukwata from COPE. You had, obviously, Julius from the EFF, and you had Muzi Maimani from the DA. These are the big parties, and as well as Mangosuthu Buthelezi from the IFP. These are the big opposition parties that were there. It was very strangely, and I must tell you, because it was the first time we're seeing opposition parties singing together in one voice.
Absolutely.
Standing together on an issue that ideologically they may all have different views in terms of how they want the elections to go, but when it comes to the issue of state funding for the lawyers of the Marikana miners, they were all singing in one voice.
Yeah.
What was very interesting to see in the morning was that you had a bit of a standoff between EFF supporters and DA supporters who were sort of singing insults to each other. But by the time 12 o'clock arrived, and they were all marching towards the union buildings, and they got there, and they were all singing together with one voice, and on the podium, they were all saying the same things. They were all saying we need to support the miners of Marikana, and it's a great injustice. So it was, I really don't think that we've seen that in South Africa recently, whereby opposition parties are standing together against government on one particular issue. I don't think even with the e-tolling issue, we had opposition parties all coming together on one platform saying, we want e-tollings to be scrapped. So this issue around the legal funding for the Marikana miners was quite interesting to see how the opposition parties themselves all conducted themselves.
Obviously, was there any representation from the ANC whatsoever?
There was no representation.
No representation
from the
that you saw.
ANC. No,
okay,
there was none.
Benita, what should the responsibility of the state be?
There is a responsibility on the state to ensure that any harm perpetrated to its citizens by state officials is investigated. Well, there's a two-part responsibility. The first is to prevent it from happening. And the second is, if it does happen, then there has to be a thorough investigation. And that is standard, uncontested principles of law, both nationally and internationally. So the question is, have they fulfilled that obligation? And there's, I think, a very clear answer to that, which is not yet. It's a wait and see.
Yeah.
And think about what the Commission of Inquiry was supposed to do. It was never supposed to focus only on the police and their activity, although, of course, that was the most proximate and, for many people, the most evocative aspect of the massacre. But it was also supposed to focus on the underlying circumstances that led to this massacre.
Yeah.
And those underlying circumstances speak to something that is far harder to encapsulate in a legal discussion. It speaks to what some people call the social wage. So it's supposed to understand why mining in this country looks a little bit like mining 200 years ago, just after slavery and the abolition of slavery. And if we still have that today, and we're talking about are their lawyers being paid, that for me is the tip of the iceberg. The real question is, are they going to get to the truth, and is there going to be substantive change?
All right. Well, the hard words to leave this interview on, but I think that, unfortunately, this is what appears to be reality from what we're looking at from this distance. Benita Meyersfeld from the Centre for Applied Studies, thank you very much for joining us, representing the South African Human Rights Commission, and the reporter working on the story, Nozi Ntombamia, thank you very much for joining us here on Morning Live. Before I let you go, where to from here? Very quickly, what happened? So the memorandum was handed over. Is that the end?
The memorandum was handed over yesterday. They've given government up until the end of business today to give a response, pending which they will divulge over the weekend the next step forward.
Okay.
On Monday, the commission hearing resumes again, and Darlene Pofu and the miners will go back to the commission to give feedback in terms of what has happened from when the march started, and if they did get any response from government, and what their next steps
are going forward. Thank you very much. Thanks for the update. All right, let's take a break here on Morning Live. When we return, a heritage portal.